In the last talk on Islam and how I believe we will see an Islamic Antichrist, it will come through Islam, and there are many other aspects of that which we could have touched on. I talked about the seven-headed dragon which represents Satan's kingdom of this world, how one of the heads had received a fatal wound and had recovered, and my belief is that represents the eighth kingdom, the final kingdom, the Antichrist kingdom, the recovered heads. And I explained how Roman Empire petered out over 1,000 years, but Islam came to a sudden end. And particularly the removal of the caliph was an event which has reverberated round the Muslim world. Until now, we're starting to see the effects of that on Islam. So that happened in 1924. I would say, to the amazement of the world, Islam is now coming back to life, and people are amazed by it, and they're going to see far more. We're only just beginning to see what's going to happen. So, this talk's a bit different. I'm going to talk about the Muslim Brotherhood. Some of you may have good knowledge of it, others haven't, but I've usually found this background is very important if you really want to understand what's going on in the Middle East today. The Muslim Brotherhood is fundamental to the rebirth of Islam. It really is the key organisation which has led to the rebirth of Islam in our day and age. So we're going to have to go to a bit of history. The Arab Spring, so-called, of 2011. Egypt. Sorry? It's got at the top. Oh, to here it is. I swear, yes. 2011, the Western press reported the events of the Middle East as a popular uprising to dislodge the dictatorial regimes and replace them with democratic governments. That's how the West wanted to see it. And the events were compared to the fall of communism, which had happened some years before. But there was a very great difference in what happened in the Middle East then and the previous fall of communism. In 1989, we had a good idea who was going to replace those leaders who were toppled by the revolution. So in the various countries, Havel in the Czech Republic and Valencia in Poland and others, they were on the scenes, and we understood what was likely to happen with communism falling. Who would fill the vacuum? But in the Middle East, we saw a vacuum being left with the toppling of these dictators, and the question arose, who would fill that vacuum? And I suggested at the time, and some of this material comes from talks I gave at the time, despite the Western press not really understanding what was going on, I suggested the only people who could fill the vacuum were the Muslim Brotherhood. They're the people who stand waiting in the wings. So what was the Muslim Brotherhood, or what is the Muslim Brotherhood? At the time, now he may well have changed his opinion, but Jeremy Bowen, the BBC Middle East editor, called it conservative and non-violent and poorly understood, especially in the West. So that's what he said, which he led us to understand was the Muslim Brotherhood. Conservative, non-violent, poorly understood. At the time, I quoted another gentleman, Walid Shubat, who some of you know, warned that the Muslim Brotherhood was a rising dragon. This is what he was saying at the time of the Islamic Spring. A rising dragon which will deceive many by trumpeting non-violence. And the question is, which of these were the truth? So we're going to look at how the Muslim Brotherhood presented itself to the West as the first part of this talk. And we have to go back to the Ottoman Empire, which was one of the largest and most successful empires the world has ever seen. It dominated the Middle East, North Africa, vast part of the world, even though they weren't directly ruling some of these countries, they were the dominant influence and power for over 500 years. So it's a long-lasting, very extensive, very powerful empire. And the story for the Muslim Brotherhood really starts with the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. So this is 1920, and we see that the Ottoman Empire has been sort of fragmented, and really it's now down to just the country of Turkey. In the 1920s, Kemal Atatürk in the 1920s, Turkey emerged as a secular state under Kemal Atatürk. And in 1924, Atatürk, very much under British influence, abolished the caliph. That is a picture of the last Islamic caliph. Quoting Joel Richardson, who we've quoted before, in order to begin to understand the collective psychological wound that the abolition of the caliph has had on the Muslim world, imagine if the office of Pope was forcefully abolished by anti-Catholic forces and remained unfilled for nearly 100 years. The theological and psychological impact this would have on Catholics globally would be profound. Likewise, without a caliph, many Muslims feel as though the universe itself has been completely out of order for the past 80 plus years. This worldview was nowhere better summarized than in a promotional video for Hizb ut-Tahrir, an Islamic group whose purpose was to restore the caliph. And therefore, in that video, it says, the 3rd of March 1924, which is what I quoted before, the world was plunged into darkness. The Khalifa, his light spread from east to west for over 1,000 years, was brought to an end. The consequences were unimaginable: death, destruction, chaos, exploitation. After 80 years of absence of the Khalifa, the Muslim world has awakened from its slumber, and the Ummah, the community of the world's Muslims, is ready to resume its political destiny from the darkness to emerge a new light. And as I said in the earlier talk, the issue for Muslims is they rely on the Hadith, and there are various collections of the Hadith, and they influence greatly the sort of approach Muslims have to their religion. So where we have these sort of denials of what is true Islam, it's largely because they're following different collections of what they believe are the teachings of Muhammad, and they come to these different conclusions. But I would say almost universal in Islam is the longing for Islam to take its place where they think it belongs, head of the world, leading nation, as the Ottoman Empire was for so many centuries, one of the great powers in the world. But they look for a much bigger Ottoman Empire, which I think one of my later slides will show. So that's what they looked for. Muslims generally want to see a restoration of Islam into its place of prominence in the world, and the way that's going to happen is the restoration of a caliph. So secular Turkey. Ataturk proceeded with the secularization of the nation. So Islamic law was separated from the civic law, and a great penal code based on the Italian introduced. The army became guardians of the secular constitution. Now it's very interesting, in recent 5-6 years, the present Prime Minister, now President of Turkey, has undermined the power of the army. In fact, at once, during the Arab Spring, in one sort of blow, he removed 160 of the top brass of the Army, Navy and Air Force and put them all in prison. While the world was distracted with what's going on in Egypt, he just got rid of them. So the army were guardians of the secular constitution. They're not anymore in Turkey. Their whole position has been reduced. So, under this background of religion and the people stripped of its leader, the caliph, the Islamic lands dominated by foreign powers moved to the secularization of society, that the Islamic Brotherhood. And it's in this time that the Islamic Brotherhood was founded. And I believe there's a scriptural context to these events, which were found in which I think I probably already covered, Revelation 7, 8 to 13, 17, sorry, 8 to 13. The beast that you saw was and is not, and will ascend out of the bottomless pit and go to perdition, and those who dwell on the earth will marvel, whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they see the beast that was and is not and yet is. Here is a mind which has wisdom, the 7 heads of 7 mountains on which the woman sits. There are also 7 kings, 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue a short time. The beast that was and is not is himself also the 8th, and is of the 7, and is going to perdition. The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have received no kingdom as yet, but they receive authority for 1 hour as kings with the beast. These are of one mind, and they will give their power and authority to the beast. This is just as a little aside. It always fascinates me that Satan is absolutely happy with that description of himself. And you find this, I've got lots of pictures of 7-headed dragons. It's amazing, isn't it? There you are, it's a 7-headed dragon. If some people ever wonder, what about Buddha? Well, you know whose man Buddha is. Satan's claimed him there, absolutely. He's 7-headed dragon over Buddha. But yes, throughout the Far East you will find 7-headed dragons. It seems as if, actually I make a point in some of the talks, many things are just staring us in our face. If we just took it as it is, we wouldn't have nearly so many problems with understanding prophecy. 7-headed dragon, yes, Satan says that's me. You know, Europa, the harlot who rides on the beast. Well, Europe seems to be only too glad to accept that identity, and so on. We can go on and on. They just stare us in the face so often, and we don't recognise the fulfilments of prophecy. And I think I already explained in the previous talk, I take from that passage the empire which is as Rome, and it's Islam which follows Rome. And Islam is the empire which had one of its heads fatally wounded, one of these 7 heads of the 7-headed dragon fatally wounded. And it's the one which will be revived. So we're seeing the revival of Islam to become the 8th empire, and the Muslim Brotherhood has played a key role in this. So we're going to go on to the history, a brief history of the Muslim Brotherhood. And much of this information I've taken directly from them, so I don't think I'm misrepresenting them. I'm just telling you what they say about themselves, how they present themselves to the Western audience. The colloquial version of the founding of the Muslim Brotherhood from the Muslim Brotherhood, this is what they say themselves, is as follows. In 1928, 6 Egyptian workers employed by British military camps in Ismailia, in the Suez Canal zone in Egypt, visited Hassan al-Banna. I think I've got a photo of him next. There he is. They visited him. A young school teacher who they'd heard preach in mosques and coffee houses on the need for an Islamic renewal. Arabs and Muslims have no status and no dignity, these workers said to Hassan al-Banna. They are no more than mere hirelings belonging to foreigners. We are unable to perceive the road to action as you perceive it. They therefore asked him to become their leader, and he accepted, founding the Society of Muslim Brothers. So Hassan al-Banna was 22 at the time. He was living in a world in which Islam had been crushed. Islamic lands were under the domination of foreign powers. The heart of Islam had been ripped out by the removal of the caliph. And Egyptian society was adopting secular Western values. So that's the world he lived in. According to the Muslim Brotherhood, from the beginning it was an Islamic revivalist movement. Its objective was to return Muslims to the precepts of the Quran and reject Western influence. So that's where it starts. And in the early years, the society was focused on education. In the 1930s, it grew rapidly from 3 branches in 1931 to 300 by 1938. And then as it developed in the 1930s, the Brotherhood undertook small-scale welfare work among the poor, set up workshops and small factories, and organised the collection and distribution of zakat, which is Islamic giving to the poor. So they organised that to make sure the poor were given money. So it becomes a charity in a sense. It also established a number of Quran schools, which were very important in a country with only sort of 20% literacy. So in a sense, almost like the Sunday school movement in this country, which also taught people to read and write, the Brotherhood copied that and set up schools to teach people to read and write Arabic and teach them about the Quran. Later, in the 1930s, it went on to found benevolent institutions such as pharmacies, clinics and hospitals. And al-Banna wanted to make Islam comprehensible to a new generation. So he was very concerned, how do you make Islam meaningful to a new generation of people? So he trained a whole cadre of young preachers to go out through the land to preach about Islam. They also founded a publishing company which produced newspapers and booklets to spread the message. And so al-Banna really, he created a new Islamic ideology for the poor and disenfranchised. He sort of worked among the bottom ranks of society. You can almost see a parallel actually in the Wesleyan revival, which went for the sort of the bottom end of society and brought such radical change to our country. So he did the same. Satan copies what Christians do. He watches and learns a lot from us. And so it developed lots of ideas as a movement. It wanted to nationalise industry, create an Islamic banking system, social welfare programmes, cap the wages of civil servants, and provide public housing schemes and land reform. So it was a socialist movement as well as a religious movement. It was a political. Above all, al-Banna saw that the solution to the problems of the modern world lay with Islam. That's his conviction. So, the consequence of this teaching
Thank you.
just today, it's all right in the sunshine. No, it's okay. The consequence of Brotherhood's nationalism became an energetic struggle against. Oh, thank you. Okay. Against colonial Egypt and Arab countries. So the key issue for al-Banna in providing this liberation was jihad, and this took 2 forms: open struggle to free Muslims from colonial occupation, and an inner struggle to free Muslims from the inner passivity and fatalism towards their condition. So it also raised money to support striking Palestinian workers during the revolt of 1936 to 1939. So it got engaged in that conflict between the Jews and Palestinians very early on. During the Second World War, the Brotherhood formed a military wing. Oh. It formed a military wing called the Secret Apparatus, but remained largely inactive in the war years. So after the Second World War, the Muslim Brotherhood grew rapidly, and it expanded its welfare program and became actively involved in politics. It had an entrenched hostility to the ruling elite of Egypt because they were Western orientated, not Islamic, so that caused conflict. In 1948, the Brotherhood organised volunteers to go and fight against Israel in the Arab-Israeli conflict of 1948, so it starts to become militant at that point. Later in 1948, members of the Brotherhood assassinated Judge Ahmed Kaxinder Bey, who had given prison sentences to members of the society for attacking British soldiers. And so at that time the government feared the Brotherhood as planning a revolution. It had schools, factories, hospitals, and was already running a state within the state. So in December 1948 the government ordered the Brotherhood to be disbanded. And weeks later, a Muslim brother assassinated the Prime Minister of Egypt. In February 1949, al-Banna was assassinated by the political police, probably on orders of the new Prime Minister. Then in October the 8th, 1951, the Egyptian Prime Minister, Nahash Pasha, declared unilateral abrogation of the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty. And so in July 1952, the Free Officers led a successful coup, ousting the monarch and taking power. So that's the officers. Among them, we've got Gamal Abdel Nasser and Anwar Sadat, both of whom had close ties with the Brotherhood. So Nasser was at first Deputy Prime Minister and then became Prime Minister and President in 1956. But relations between the government and Brotherhood quickly deteriorated because the army wouldn't share power with the Brotherhood. In October 1954, the Brotherhood was blamed for attempting to assassinate Nasser. And Nasser used that as an excuse to eliminate the Brotherhood, and the organisation was officially dissolved. Its headquarters burned and thousands of its members put in prison. So the members of the Brotherhood were being held in concentration camps under Nasser, under that newly independent Egypt, and many were tortured and died. So they were a oppressed society from the sort of mid-50s. Now this gentleman is very important, Sayyid Qutb. He was one of those put in prison and tortured. He had been the editor of the Society's newspaper and was a prolific writer. Qutb is a primary influence on the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamic fundamentalism. I'm told, and I've heard it said by Arab speakers, in this country, in most Muslim corner shops or Muslim-run businesses, if you're a Muslim and speak Arabic or can just contact them, ask, and under the counter they will have books and all sorts, Qutb, militant Islam, radical Islam, it'll all be there. And he's the person who wrote much of this stuff. So he's an incredible influence on what has been happening in the Islamic world in recent years. He saw the existing political systems of democracy in the West and collectivism in the East as having failed. Islamic lands were in the grip of dictators who had usurped the authority which was Allah's alone. And so he said the time has come for Islam to lead the way in establishing an ummah, a new society, a collective society of Muslims. This is a society of people whose lives were fully in accord with Islamic ethics. And he believed that the ummah, when it was established, would spread throughout the world. He advocated jihad, which was more than self-defense. Islam should seek by force, if necessary, to overthrow the existing powers to make way for the ummah. Well, he was, in 1965, accused of plotting a revolution, was arrested and hung. But after his death, his ideas have gone on and increased in their importance. So he's really promoting militant jihad against Western powers. Sadat, 1970 to 1981. In 1980, in response to demands from the Brotherhood, the Egyptian constitution was amended to state that Sharia was the main source of all legislation. So there you are, that's 1970-80. And despite this, the Brotherhood remained a fierce critic of the government for agreeing to the Camp David Accords. So they were really against, obviously, Sadat agreeing that. I haven't got it in this series of slides, but I've got another photo I sometimes show of Sadat going to Jerusalem to meet Begin, and it's a famous photo where he's wearing his swastika tie, you know, how to get a message across to someone you're supposed to be friendly with. But Sadat was a member of the Egyptian brown shirts during the war, which was the Egyptian equivalent of the Nazi youth. So you know where he was really coming from. Camp David, of course, I'm sure he saw as traditional Islamic practice that you agree a treaty only so long as it suits you before you break it. Then we move on to Mubarak. Under Mubarak, the Brotherhood remained officially illegal but tolerated. It kept to its reformist agenda of Islamising society from the bottom up. It was able to campaign for election to Parliament, although its candidates ran as independents. They made up a minority but influential group within Parliament. By the early 21st century, the Brotherhood claimed that it had changed, and it said it had shed its religious intolerance. Membership was now open to Copts, and it was calling for democracy in the Middle East. Hence Jeremy Bowen's comment that it was conservative, non-violent, and poorly understood, especially in the West. So we come now to events of early 2011. So the 18-day Egyptian revolt heralded a popular uprising to secure democracy. The cause of that, which is lost sight of, the real cause was food price inflation. In Egypt, it was running at 17% by the end of 2010, and ordinary Egyptian householders couldn't afford to feed their families. And with high unemployment, low wages, life was becoming impossible. So that's what triggered this revolt in 2011. So anger at the government's failure to intervene to ease the situation. And anger, of course, became focused on the head of the government. Autocratic and corrupt, he was seen as a block to changes, needed to help people. And so his departure, Mubarak's departure, became the goal of the revolution. But the Arab Spring had a predictable outcome. In the 2011-2012 elections for the People's Assembly, the Brotherhood won 235 seats. The Salafi Islamic bloc gained 121 seats. Together, the two Islamic parties gained 356 seats out of 508, and that was 65% of the vote. But in the presidential elections which followed, Mohammed Morsi failed to capitalise on the Brotherhood's previous success, and he in fact only gained 52% of the total vote. You know, despite the fact that Morsi really was such a bore, he rambled on for hours in his speeches, had nothing much to say, and people didn't really like him. The Muslim Brotherhood was so efficient in getting its voters out that they managed to get him elected. On his election, Morsi promised to lead a government which would promote national unity and represent all the people. And that's how the Muslim Brotherhood would like the West to see it. They want us to understand it to be a mainly charitable organisation which seeks to revive Islam, and its mission is to rescue the world. So, you know, if we left it like that, and how the Muslim Brotherhood was presenting itself prior to 2011, we would probably have to say, well, Jeremy Bowen seems about right. Well, by the end of 2013, by June 2013, Morsi had been in office less than a year, and the petition asking for his removal had received 22 million signatures. And on the 30th of June 2013, 30 million people turned out on the streets to demand that Morsi be removed. Now the West and the Western governments have tended to sort of say that was a sort of military coup. It couldn't be further from the truth. It was a popular uprising against extreme Islam. The next day, the Muslim Brotherhood's offices were burnt to the ground, ransacked and burnt. And then, as we know, the army stepped in to remove Morsi. So what went wrong with the Muslim Brotherhood? You know, we asked, was Morsi incompetent, or was he being true to the true ideals of his party? Well, what we saw is while he was in office, he spent time creating a new constitution based on Sharia law and furthering the interests of his fellow members of the Brotherhood. He totally failed to tackle the problems which had ousted Mubarak, such as rising food prices and high unemployment. Just looking again then at the Muslim Brotherhood, this is their badge. And there are three mottos connected with the Muslim Brotherhood. The single Arabic word Wa-a-iddou, which is at the top, on the emblem of the Brotherhood, means prepare. And it's a reminder to members of the Quranic verse, prepare against them as you are able of force and cavalry to terrorize Allah's enemies and yours. In other words, fight against Allah's enemies. That's one of their mottos. Their main motto is al-Islam Wa-a-iddou. Islam is the solution. And the full version of this is Allah is our objective, the Prophet is our leader, Quran is our law, Jihad is our way, dying in the name of Allah, our highest hope. So they're expressing an underlying belief that violence is justified to bring about the vision of an ideal world. Jihad is the Way is the title of a book by Mustafa Mashur, who led the Muslim Brotherhood from 1996 to 2002, and it was translated into English by Palestinian Media Watch. In this book, Mashur explains the fundamental concepts of the Brotherhood ideology. He covers topics such as establishment of an Islamic State, world domination under Islam, the public and personal duty of military jihad, and warnings not to rush into jihad until it is prepared and timed for maximum benefit. I think you've heard, there's in Egypt, there are Brotherhood supporters and Salafists who are also extreme Islamic group. And the basic difference between a Salafist and a Muslim brother is timing. Salafists want to get on and overthrow existing world order, governments, etc. now. Brotherhood people bide their time and look for the right opportunity. And that's the key issue, not the aims and objectives, just when they're going to do it. They bide their time. The book sets out the aims and method for jihad. First is a revival of faith is the starting point, and revitalization of the Islamic Ummah, the Islamic nation. That's their starting point. So that it can regain its power and be liberated from and assume its rightful position, which was intended by Allah, the most exalted nation on earth. So their aim is to revive Islam, to become the leading nation of the earth. And they believe that through this religion they're going to deliver humanity from darkness and light. In other words, they believe they have a new way forward. The old systems of democracy or collectivism have failed. They're now showing you a new way. To understand that is going to be very important as we get to the end of this talk. So, how will Islam be restored to preeminence? The methods outlined are summarized in the following quotes. The Imam and Shaheed martyr Hassan al-Banna writes in his treatise on Jihad, all the sages, The earliest and the latter ones agree that jihad is a religious public duty to spread dua, that's Islamic missionary activity, incumbent upon the Islamic nation, and is a personal duty to fend off the infidels' attack on the nation. The Muslims today, as you know, are humiliated by others, dominated by infidels. Their land is overrun and their holy places are desecrated. Therefore there exists an unavoidable personal duty for every Muslim to equip himself and prepare and gear up towards jihad until the opportunity arises and Allah will determine his word. So Muslims are to prepare for this jihad warfare to restore Islam. In a section with the title The Muslim Brotherhood Stance Regarding Jihad, we read of the rejection of negotiation and the call for aggression. Jihad for Allah's sake has been forcing itself upon the Islamic region in recent years and has become tangibly noticeable in parts of the Islamic world. In other parts of the Islamic world there is a tide of preparation for jihad in the sense that it is unavoidable and is the only way to retaliate against the aggressiveness of Allah's enemies and to liberate Islamic land from its occupier and invaders. It's become a widespread and convincing opinion that the way of negotiation and peace treaties with Allah's enemies instead of jihad is surrender in the name of peace. So they reject peace treaties. Wa-a-iddou and many others have said that the prime purpose behind the establishment of the Muslim Brotherhood was to restore the caliph. And the English propaganda put out by the Brotherhood vigorously denies this, but this quote clarifies their intentions. Additionally, without jihad and the preparation towards it, the obligation cast upon every Muslim to establish an Islamic state and a Islamic caliphate and to consolidate this religion will not be realized. So in the English propaganda it's denied that al-Banna had an interest in restoring the caliph. In Arabic, al-Banna is cited as the inspiration for the action. A quote again from the book. He, Hassan al-Banna, felt the grave danger and overshadowing the Muslims and the urgent need and obligation which Islam places on every Muslim man and woman to act in order to restore the Islamic caliphate and to establish the Islamic state on strong foundations and to liberate the Muslims and defend them from an attack and spread the dawah, Islamic missionary activity of Islam in the world and to establish this great religion which Allah wanted for his servants. You know, and there are many Muslims who will claim that jihad is just about inner renewal and it's nothing to do with aggressive warfare. So the next quote clarifies that to the Muslim Brotherhood, jihad is a military action. In all his, Hassan al-Banna's writings and conversations, he always urged towards jihad and arousing the desire for seeking shahada, martyrdom. He did not content himself only with speech and writing, and when the opportunity arrived for jihad in Palestine, he hurried and seized it. The Muslim Brotherhood provided the most magnificent models for jihad and courage, and were it not for the evil scheming and treachery on the part of the leaders of the Muslim countries of the time, the situation would have been different. So he blames the failure of the Muslims to throw the Jews out of Israel on the treachery of the leaders of the Islamic nations. Note the attitude towards the treachery of their rulers. Now that's a good starting point if you want to know what's going on in the Middle East. You know, the regard for the leaders of the nations, treacherous. This aggressive understanding of jihad is reinforced in the next quote. Jihad is not only for repelling an assault, but also for the purpose of establishing an Islamic state. It should be known that jihad and preparation towards jihad are not only for the purpose of fending off assault and attacks of Allah's enemies from the Muslims, but also for the purpose of realizing the great task of establishing an Islamic state and strengthening the religion and spread of it round the world. And then there's another one that they recognize that the prime duty of jihad will fall on the Muslim youth. The book concludes with the words, "Work for an honourable death, and you will be thus granted full happiness. May Allah provide us and you the honour of achieving the Shahada martyrdom for him." So it's a very different picture from the public image that Brotherhood wanted to present. The ultimate goal envisioned by the Brotherhood is to bring the whole world under the rule of Allah. And I must say, the Brotherhood is not a sort of global conspiracy. It's rather a loose-knit organisation. It's got representatives, organisations in over 70 countries, but it's not an international conspiracy. Its real importance is the power of the idea. It's an idea which allows the downtrodden Islamic world to regain its respect and see a way to once again gain ascendancy among the nations. So I attribute the revitalisation of Islam in the last part of the 20th century and in the 21st century in great measure down to the work of vision of al-Banna, his motivated preachers, and the others connected with the Brotherhood. They're the ones who focused Islamic minds on this goal of once again achieving ascendancy. We're seeing the consequences of its revival every year. It's increasing and growing wherever we look. Now, some believe that Islam will overreach itself and collapse. In fact, the reversal of its fortunes, which led to the ousting of Morsi, is interpreted as that by some. But I disagree. I see Islam as the dragon which will fulfill prophetic events which close the present age. Well, we know that in response to the removal of Morsi, the Brotherhood took it out on the small Christian community in Egypt, and the tolerance which they once boasted of was completely removed. So that's just one of the many burnt out churches following their action after Morsi was removed. So it may take time for the Muslim Brotherhood to recover, but it will, because it's been through all this before. I thought this was interesting. This map was prepared by Turkish Muslim author Adnan Oktar, who's one of the most widely published authors in the Islamic world. Huge publishing company and printing press. He's got sort of hundreds of books to his name. And it's the initial target of the revived caliphate. All the areas in yellow, spreading from the Atlantic to the Pacific, through much of India, throughout the Indonesia and the all lands which were once ruled by Islam. So that's the initial target which they're looking to achieve. From the start of the Muslim Brotherhood, the restoring of the caliph has been their one really big idea, which is catching on. Historian Niall Ferguson, in an interview with the Daily Telegraph, said that the Middle Eastern with a restored caliph was possible by 2021. Well, that was a few 2 or 3 years ago. We're starting to question whether that might not be a lot earlier than that. In 2005, a report issued by the US National Intelligence Council, which is a centre for strategic thinking within the US government, said that in their report, Mapping the Global Future Project 2020, predicted within the next few years we may expect to see the emergence of a revived Islamic caliphate. In the West, we need to recognise it's not democracy that the nations of the Middle East are looking for. They're not interested. They're crying out for a leader who will restore Islamic pride, Islamic ascendancy. That's what they really want. Not the corrupt leaders they've had, not the dictators of politicians they've had, but a leader who will lift Islam out of the doldrums. So, I just bring a word about ISIS. So that's given you background. I hope you've understood. Going through that information isn't too tedious, but it really, I think, is so important to get the background, to understand what's going on, in the minds of people living in the Middle East, because the Western press misreports it. It doesn't understand it. I've got a very good book at home written by a French diplomat in 1957, and he had lived in the Middle East nearly all his life. And he commented, the problem with the West is it really cannot enter the Muslim mind. It just does not understand. And he said particularly American foreign policy has always failed in the Middle East because they really just cannot understand the Muslim mind. So going through that is just to try and give you an introduction to what they're looking for, what they're hoping for. And the caliph is the big idea. That is the big idea. The world was shocked this summer by the spread of ISIS, or the Islamic State. And it claims to be a caliphate. So it's changed, and that is a momentous move. We actually now, once again, have on the ground a caliph governing a very large area of the Middle East with fighters. One lovely comment on the internet by a lady who's an official in the National Coordinator for Security and Counter-Terrorism in the Netherlands. She said that, of course, ISIS is just a Zionist plot. And, you sort of think, yes, well, everything is a Zionist plot, we all know that. Nothing happens without those Zionists. When I first heard about ISIS, my thoughts first went to Revelation 9, 14 and 15. Revelation 9, verses 14 and 15. Saying to the sixth angel who had the trumpet, release the four angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates. So the four angels who had been prepared for the hour and day and month and year were released to kill a third of mankind. So we hear a voice coming from the altar, which is before the throne of God, and it commands release of four demonic angels bound at the great river Euphrates. And it says God's prepared them for a purpose. So he's known from the beginning the exact time when he will release them, and they're for his purpose. And they're bound at the great river Euphrates, which is actually where ISIS has emerged from. And their purpose is quite shocking: to kill 1/3 of mankind. If you think about that, if that's 2.4 million people in the current population statistics. 2.4 million people. That's unimaginable. So you might say, well, that's just figurative, couldn't you? But what if it's literal? What if this is literal? And I think it is. What are we going to say? And also, it's a challenge to those who complain, how can a God of love do? And now you're ending, how can a God of love do? How can a God of love possibly release demonic powers which are going to end up killing 1/3 of mankind? Well, the explanation is given in verses 20 and 21. It's to bring the world to repentance. That's why he allows it. God has a purpose. It must break his heart to have to act in this way.
It is breaking it there.
But that's how it is.
It is, unfortunately.
ISIS is demonic. And it emerged from the river Euphrates, from the area of the river Euphrates, probably about a year or so ago. And it came to prominence with its rapid conquest of territory earlier in the summer. And the world's been stunned by the brutality. They can't believe what's happening. I mean, we've made a big thing about the hostages, but compared to the local people, the hostages have got off lightly. I mean, it's incredible, the terrible things which have been happening, the total inhumanity. And the West can't cope. What to do? Well, it's going to say it's going to try and eliminate ISIS. You can't. ISIS knows that. They believe even if they take immense losses, provided some survive, they will go on and win the victory. So what is the significance of ISIS? I believe it's a warning. It is a very serious warning. I'm going to read the whole of Revelation 9, verses 13 to 20. Then the sixth angel sounded, and I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar which is before God, saying to the sixth angel who had the trumpet, release the four angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates. So the four angels who had been prepared for the hour and day and month and year were released to kill a third of mankind. Now the number of the army of the horsemen was 200 million. I heard the number of them. And thus I saw the horses in the vision. Those who sat on them had breastplates of fiery red, hyacinth blue and sulphur yellow. And the heads of the horses were like the heads of lions, and out of their mouth came fire, smoke, and brimstone. By these three plagues a third of mankind was killed, by the fire and the smoke and the brimstone which came out of their mouths. For their power is in the mouth and in their tails. For their tails are like serpents, having heads with them. They do harm. But the rest of the mankind who were not killed by these plagues did not repent of the works of their hands, that they should not worship demons and idols of gold and silver and brass and stone and wood, which can neither see nor hear nor walk. And they did not repent of their murders, or their sorceries, or their sexual immorality, or their thefts. This is the sixth trumpet. Well, the trumpet judgments, I believe, are all demonic judgments. That's something, again, which may need more explanation, but I believe they're all actually demonic judgments on this world. Behind them are demons, stirring mankind up to destruction and war against each other. And that's what they're all about. The sixth trumpet heralds the final, well, the second to final, the second woe which comes on this world, and has two parts. It has the part we just read about these demonic powers stirring the world up to war and the third of people being killed, and then the second part is the beast and his kingdom, which is what moves on from it. So in order, I believe this does come before the beast kingdom. That's where it's set in Revelation, and I believe this is the time of chaos which prepares the world for the Antichrist. We note that this is the New King James Version I just read. It gives the number of the army as 200 million, or literally it was myriad and 2 times myriad, which myriad often believed to be 10,000. But I believe the number should be used because John says, I heard the number of them. He calls our attention to the number. So he says, look, so I believe he did mean us to understand it as a number, a specific number. Now, he's astonished by it because the population of the Roman Empire at the time John was living was 70 million. Romans liked having lots of censuses, so we know pretty well it was about 70 million. So he says, you know, in a world where 70 million populated the largest empire in the world, he's saying 200 million. It's an unbelievable number for him, is what he sees. Now, I used to understand this passage, you know, or is this China, or is this Russia coming down to attack? Now, what's going on here? I have to say, I believe, and praying over this and convinced about this, no, it's not. This is Islam. And what we're seeing here is a warning. In the order of events, I said, this is a chaotic time, a terrible turmoil which comes before the kingdom of the beast. But I believe, as I read Revelation, the fall of Babylon comes before that. And I also, again, believe that Babylon the Great, mother of harlots, represents the kingdom of this world, which is best represented, as again I say, by self-identification, as the Western world and the Western economies. They're going to collapse. They're going to be brought down very rapidly, sometime soon, by direct action by the Islamic nations. the nations which will give their power to the Antichrist. They're going to do something which collapses the world economy. And if you read Trumpet Sounds regularly, you know that I go on and on about the debt of the Western nations. Our debt levels are so phenomenal, we cannot go on. Our government has no room to manoeuvre if we have another crisis. Before they borrow their way out of the crisis, but we cannot go on borrowing. We've borrowed so much, we're still mounting up debt after debt after debt. We can do it while the economies are growing and prospering a bit. But if something happens in the Middle East which causes that to stutter, it will collapse. We're at that point, and I personally believe that is Babylon the Great, coming down, crushed, falling. We will have a world which is not that dissimilar to 1920s and 1930s Germany. The destruction and collapse of the economy is going to leave us, struggling. I mean, the Lord will bless us and keep us going if we're still here. As I've said earlier, I'm not going to make any comments about exactly when the Lord takes us out. I believe, hallelujah, it's up to the Father, and I believe both in the imminent return of Christ, and I believe we should teach prophecy right the way through, so whenever the Lord decides to call time. As Christians, we're to look up. We're to rejoice. Every day brings us nearer to the day that Jesus Christ will come back, because that's the certainty. Now, I can tell you that. Okay, you can listen, you say, yeah, maybe. But there's one thing there's no doubt about. Jesus Christ is coming back for his church. And that's not negotiable. My interpretations, things I've said today, I believe sincerely they're right. But it's what I've heard as I pray. I don't claim infallibility, but I do on this issue. Jesus Christ is coming back for his church. He's going to save us. And he says when these things begin to happen, not when they're finished, when they begin, look up, rejoice, hallelujah. And into a world, if the Lord leaves us in this world and we see these things begin to happen, we're going to be the people who others look to and say, well, why are you so hopeful? Why are you confident? Look what's happening in the world. Our hearts are fainting with fear. We just don't know what's the outcome of all this is going to be. And we're going to say, yes, but I do. I do. I know that Jesus Christ is coming back. Hallelujah. So that's why I believe this is a great warning. The demonic angels will be, maybe they've already been released, because sometimes I believe in the Bible it describes the effects of events which have already taken place. So maybe the demonic angels are already released, they're already at work, they're already stirring up, and it's going to snowball. And all those other things we haven't seen yet, the processes are all starting to get stirred up. So, that's where I leave it.